Welcome back to The Shed. Tonight I want to take a look at the 1982 Nebula award-winning novel by Michael Bishop, No Enemy But Time. Now Michael was up against some giants in the genre. He was up against the likes of Brian Aldiss, Philip K. Dick, Asimov, Heinlein and Gene Wolfe. So he did amazingly well to win the Nebula that year, being amongst those great names in the genre. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll make some recommendations, we'll put it to the memory test, and I'll rank it on our ever-growing Sci-Fi Shed ladder, where I've been ranking all the Hugo and Nebula awards. So the story is written in alternating chapters. On one side, we have the story of young John Monagle, who's this orphan who's just been taken in by this US Air Force personnel in Hugo Monagle and his wife Jeanette. And what we learn is that John is suffering from some pretty severe night terrors. So much so that they're actually worried for his health. He seems to go into these dreamlike trances and convulses and has all sorts of really terrible night terrors. And what we learn through the book is that these terrors seem to be some kind of dream that takes him back to the prehistoric era of man's rise on the planet. So the other part of the story revolves around this guy called Joshua Camper. And Camper is just about to take a trip back into history around the Pleistocene time during the times of the Homo habilis, the pre-Homo erectus humans that sort of walked the earth. So the book alternates between John and Joshua, and we soon realize that John and Joshua are the same person. It's not a big spoiler. It's actually, I think, even on the back of the book here, on the blurb. But we soon quickly realize that they are one and the same person. So we learn about John growing up, some of the trials and tribulations that he had, dealing with his night terrors, the strain that it had on his family, in particular his relationship with his mother, as well as his father and sibling. And the other account really talks to Joshua and his experience traveling back to the Pleistocene era in African savanna there, some 2 million years in history. So he just come across this clan of Homo habilis, and they're the sort of precursor to Homo erectus. So Joshua tells the story of how he tries to infiltrate the clan, tries to become trusted by them to ultimately becoming a member of that tribe. Eventually, the two stories come together for a pretty interesting finale. It really is a story, I think, about personal struggle, finding one's place, acceptance, and love and loss. So I found it to be a pretty interesting novel, one that I haven't seen talked about too much online, but is definitely a worthy Nebula award-winning novel. So what did I like about it? Look, I think Michael Bishop did a really good job of describing the prehistoric era. Several times, if I'm completely honest, several times in the novel, I sort of almost put the book down and started daydreaming, thinking, what would it be like traveling back into history and witnessing some of these things, right? So I think that Michael's language was really well done, and I think it got your imagination running. And like I said, I did put the book down a few times just because it took me back, thinking, wow, what would it be like to go into history and witnessing some of the events that he witnessed? So I really enjoyed that part of the book. I also enjoyed the time-traveling themes to this novel. I'm a sucker for time-traveling novels. I mentioned that several times in the past. That is one of the things I enjoy about science fiction is, the time machine. H.G. Wells was one of the first novels that I read as a kid, really, and it stuck with me. And that kind of time-traveling theme has grown with me, and I do always enjoy reading time-traveling novels. So this was no exception. There are a couple of things I'll nitpick when I talk to my dislike section, but overall, I also enjoy the theme of time-traveling. The other thing I would say is that the novel is largely well written. I thought Michael, he's got, I think, an English major, and I think he teaches English if I remember correctly. So he's got a really strong grasp of the English language. And I say that generally speaking, the novel is quite well written. But I have to say, and maybe this is a tangent into some of the things that I didn't like, is that, occasionally, and it happened once or twice in the novel, he'd throw away all that really good writing for a throwaway line that was just below the belt, like if we're in a boxing ring. There's a couple of times that he would make this, he would be describing one of these habilist women that I thought, we really need to go there? And for those of you who read the book, you probably know what I'm talking about. But there are a couple of instances in there that, in a couple of sentences that just really undid all the great work that I think, generally speaking, is a well-written novel. So yeah, just a couple of caveats there. Just a couple of times that I just found, like, I found it to be distasteful almost. But look, it's a minor criticism, but one that was, blaring at me when I was reading through the novel, right? And I suspect that may really detract some people from the full enjoyment of this one. The other thing I would say is, as much as I enjoyed the time traveling theme to this novel, it's never really well explained, right? I think there's no explanation at all as to how the time machine works and how Joshua/John's dream traveling sort of plays a part in that. So this is far from, hard science fiction. I would say it's more touching towards the fantasy than it is science fiction, but I guess it is definitely a science fiction novel at that. But yeah, I would say that there wasn't enough science in there for me to at least understand a little bit about what makes this time traveling device work. The other thing that I would say that it wasn't very palatable to me was John's relationship with one of the Homo habilis that he meets. Now, all I would ask you to do, if you're really wanting to get into my mind and say, what's it talking about? Do a search for Homo habilis and have a look at what they look like. And then ask yourself, could you have a relationship with something that looked like that? And I'll leave it at that, right? But that aspect of the novel, I thought, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I just don't quite get it. Look, it's a pretty big sticking point for me. I was going to say some minor criticism. Look, it may be a minor criticism to some of you out there. I've got to stress that. But for me, it was a real big hurdle, one that I found really difficult to get over. But look, everyone's different, and it might not be your reading experience. I'm just highlighting things that I found sort of bizarre in this one. So when it comes to the memory test, again, this is one that didn't really hit me hard. Now, I sort of remembered what it was about as I started reading through it, but it must have been, I don't know, a good 22, 23 years ago when I first read Michael Bishop's No Enemy But Time. But honestly, this time around, I really couldn't remember much of it. I really couldn't remember much of the plot, and I definitely didn't remember the ending. And I'd have to say that the ending wasn't too bad. I found it to be acceptable, but it was just something that just did not really rank high. And I remember that was also my experience the first time round. Like, typically what I found growing up, reading these great novels, is that when a new Hugo or Nebula award-winning novel came across one of these secondhand bookshops that I used to visit, I'd pick it up and read it, and I just used to fall in love with these books and say, I'm going to go out there and buy every single Robert Silverberg novel that I can find. I'm going to go out there and buy every single Larry Niven novel that I can find. I'm going to go out and buy every single Frank Herbert novel that I could find. That was generally what used to happen when I came across one of these great novels. But I've got to say, I remember reading Michael Bishop 30 odd years ago, and honestly, I've not read any other Michael Bishop novel. So it was just, it's okay, and I think I'm doing myself a bit of disjustice not reading more Michael Bishop. So I've got a couple in my TBR that I will eventually get to, because I think it is a good enough novel, but maybe I'm giving a bit of a spoiler as to where this one may rank on our sci-fi shed ladder. When it comes to similar novels that we've covered to date on the sci-fi shed ladder, if you've enjoyed novels like Connie Willis's The Doomsday Book, I think there is still enough in No Enemy But Time for you to enjoy that one as well. As well as Falling Woman, similar themes, right, where she's got visions of traveling back in time, and there's a question mark as to how realistic is it, are these things really happening? And I would say there was a bit of an element of that in No Enemy But Time as well. But again, I think if you enjoyed Falling Woman, there may be a large element that you may enjoy in No Enemy But Time. And up and coming, we'll be covering this sometime this year, Robert J. Sawyer's The Hominids, which also I think won a Hugo and or Nebula. I'd have to double check. But this will be coming up. And again, it explores similar themes. So if you've enjoyed Hominids, I think you would also enjoy No Enemy But Time. So we've got to make another big decision and rank this one on our growing sci-fi shed ladder. So let me flip the camera around and we'll get to it. So back to the shed ladder to rank tonight's 1982 Nebula Award-winning novel by Michael Bishop, No Enemy But Time. So it's going to be a really interesting one to rank because this is one of those novels that I thoroughly enjoyed from cover to cover. But when I look at my criteria and the weighted inputs that are used for my criteria, I think I'm going to find it difficult to rank on the A side and the B side for that matter. Because the things that I'm looking for is like the theme. How strong is that concept, right? The concept in the fantasy or science fiction theme. How well executed is that concept? I look at things like the writing, like the characters, the character arc and what kind of journey these characters go on. I look at things like the plot. I look at the ending and my overall enjoyment. And when I put all that criteria to this novel, I think it's going to be somewhere on the C side. And I thought a good place to start would be with the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Now, I've got to say that was a pretty interesting concept, and it was sort of well executed as well. What really let it down for me was just the writing and the characters. I just had zero interest in those characters, and I absolutely just did not like Jemisin's writing in that particular novel at all. So I'm going to have to say that Michael Bishop's No Enemy But Time is going to do better than the 5th season on our sci-fi shed ladder. The Falling Woman is also an interesting one because I also felt that was a pretty interesting concept and it was sort of well executed. But the main concerns I had with that novel is I just couldn't really rationalize or categorize that novel as a fantasy novel. I just don't think it had all the elements that really make it a fantasy novel, but I thought it was a well-written novel. It was a pretty interesting story, but the concept fell short because of those fantasy themes for me. Which now takes us to The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, which we've only covered recently on this channel as well. And with Fritz Leiber, The Big Time, I really thoroughly enjoyed the concept, but I was so disappointed in the execution. I thought that could have been just one of my all-time favorite novels, but I just felt like it just failed in execution, which is somewhat similar to this novel, right? I thought it was a very interesting concept. The execution wasn't quite done as well, but the writing was very good as well. So it's a very interesting one. But I'm going to have to say that I've made up my mind and I made my decision. And I'm going to rank Michael Bishop's No Enemy But Time just a little bit under The Big Time by Fritz Leiber. And I would have to say it's because I thought that concept was slightly stronger one. And some of those one-liners that Fritz Leiber came up with in that novel as concepts were I thought just brilliant. But I do feel the writing was a bit better. So a slightly stronger concept, strongly better written novel in my mind. But everything else was pretty much on par. What do you think about Fritz Leiber's The Big No Enemy But Time, I should say, by Michael Bishop? Have you read it? Would you recommend it? Would you recommend any other Michael Bishop novel? This one has sort of whet my appetite again. I'd love to read some more of Michael Bishop. Do you agree, disagree? Would you have ranked it higher, lower? Or you felt it shouldn't have won the Nebula at all? I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions as always, and I'll see you next time in the shed.